one of the greatest authors of all time, was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. His actual birth date is uncertain, but most scholars believe he was born on or near April 23, 1564.
We think he may have been educated in the King's School at Stratford because that would have been typical for a child with a father who was an alderman. What we do know is that he didn't go to university.
We have a marriage record for Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway in 1585. We also have baptism records for a daughter and a set of twins. And we also know that his son, Hamnet, one of the twins, died.
Shakespeare moved to London in the late 1580s. By the early 1590s, we know he's writing, and we know that he's acting.
By 1597, Shakespeare had authored 15 of the 37 plays attributed to him, including Romeo and Juliet, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor.
People think of William Shakespeare as an artist, a playwright. He was a pretty good businessman.
In 1599, he built the largest open-air amphitheatre in London, the Globe Theatre.
He was an entrepreneur, he knew his market, he knew how to cater to that market, he made shrewd real estate investments.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, changed its name to the King's Men when King James became its patron in 1603. This was a mark of exceptional prestige.
The different types of Shakespeare plays, they're separated into histories, comedies, tragedies, and then later on tragicomedies.
Shakespeare's phrases, the ways he used words, are so common that people often get mixed up and can't remember if they came from the Bible or from Shakespeare. My grandmother used to say, when something bad happened, that these were the slings and arrows of everyday life. She was not an educated woman, and she didn't go to Shakespeare plays. She didn't get that one from the Bible.
What scholars call Shakespeare's middle period, from 1595 to 1605, included such classic comedies as Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. He also produced Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth during this period.
Right at the cusp where Shakespeare begins to write Lear, it tips into what we could call the later Shakespeare. And this period produces Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Tempest, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline.
Shakespeare wrote great stories. For example, one of the stories starts with a king who is tired, he doesn't want to govern anymore, so he says to his three daughters, I'm going to separate the kingdom between the three of you, but it's going to be based on who tells me how much they love me. However much you love me, that's how much of the kingdom you're going to get. Now that's going to make me sit up. I mean, what a way to start a story. And that's King Lear.
Shakespeare was not only a playwright, he also was a poet, partly because of economic necessity. During the early 1590s, plague closed the theaters in London, and there was quite a vogue for producing sonnets.
Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, in addition to several narrative poems.
Shakespeare worked the English language, milked it for all it was worth, made up words if it didn't give him the right words. He is one of the first professional writers.
The details of William Shakespeare's death remain a mystery, but scholars believe he died on his birthday, April 23, 1616. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare's influence has only grown. His writing is the second most quoted after the Bible. He has been credited with introducing almost 3,000 words to the English language, and a Google search on Shakespeare returns more than 140 million results.
Behind me is Shakespeare's Theatre, rebuilt recently, but it was originally constructed in the 17th century, and its name is the Globe, which comes from the expression everyone in the world is an actor. The conditions at the time when this would have been built were very different from the way actors work now. It was all done during the day because they didn't have enough money to afford candles to put on the plays at night. So there would have been far more interaction between the public and the actors, and in fact the groundlings, which were the cheapest seats just under the open cover, they would shout at the actors and throw things at them if they didn't like the play. At the time as well, none of the actors were women because they weren't allowed to be in plays. And also the church was very critical of theatre. It called it the nest of the devil, and it was usually just outside the city walls because it wasn't really allowed in those days. It was seen as something very popular and affordable because, just as I said before, the cheapest seats could be afforded by everyone. gambling stand, and to come here it's only £5 to see a play, and they say it's one of the best places, even though if it rains umbrellas aren't allowed, so you're going to get wet. But they say it would have been the best place as well because the audience participated, so you were right next to the actor's foot. You could see up his nose, and if he spat down at you, as I said, there's no umbrellas allowed, so it would have been a big problem. But there's great participation because the audience can see you, the actors, everybody's involved in the play, which makes kind of a difference from the typical West End play where everybody's in the dark. Here, you felt like you were really part of it.
This journey into the mind of Shakespeare begins in Stratford-on-Avon, his birthplace, and home now to the Royal Shakespeare Company. This was where Shakespeare spent his formative years, and it's pretty typical of a late medieval market town, growing in size in the 16th century, growing in prosperity under the influence of the merchant class, the guilds.
Shakespeare's father was a guildsman, he was a glove maker. This was the house where he worked, and Shakespeare was born in one of those upper rooms. Now, we don't know much about his early life, but there's this great scene in one of his plays where he talks about the ages of man. First, the infant mewling and puking in his nurse's arms, and then the schoolboy, with his satchel and his shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And that image captures a profound transformation shaking up 16th century society, the way that education, learning, was moving out of the hands of the privileged few into the hands now of the humble son of a Stratford glove maker.
Once, schooling in this country was controlled by the church. But all that changed with the Reformation. Shakespeare's school in Stratford, the Edward VI Grammar School, was founded by the town's guildsmen. It offered scholarships for the town's deserving poor and charged fees for those better off. Boys only, 40 boys in all. And this was where the sons of Stratford's merchant class came to learn the skills necessary to inherit the family business.
Later in his career, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, sneered that Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek, which is pretty ironic considering how rigorous the education here would have been. By the time he left school at the age of 16, Shakespeare would have known more Latin than any classics graduate at university today. He'd have been saturated in the ancient world. He'd have read Pliny and Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, all the great classical philosophers and historians and natural scientists. The century before his birth had seen a rediscovery in classical knowledge, a rebirth, as it was called, a renaissance of knowledge, fueled by the printing press. But what excites me even more about the 16th century, more than the Renaissance of the 15th century, is that by now we were daring to question this ancient knowledge. We were daring to look for ourselves, making up our own minds as to how the world really works. Rather than just blindly trusting medieval doctors, for instance, with their frankly ignorant ideas as to how the human body works, by now we were performing anatomies, stripping away the flesh, confronting the reality of the human condition. And in a strange kind of way, this is exactly what Shakespeare was doing in his plays. He was showing us as we really are, as multi-layered human beings with all of our subtleties and our contradictions. And it was this growing sense of self-awareness, self-knowledge in the 16th century that drags us out of the medieval into the modern.
Shakespeare came to London as a travelling player in the year 1588. What he encountered here in London was a world of horizons pushed back. Elizabethan London spilled beyond the boundaries of the old medieval walled city. Houses fronted the river now down to Westminster, and on the south bank in Southwark, beyond the control of the old city guilds, there stood brothels and theatres and taverns, the earthy exuberance of a rich and varied life.
If I had to sum up in one word what was new about Shakespeare's London, I'd say it was cosmopolitan. The word quite literally means moving beyond national boundaries, and London did that too. The Thames was full of shipping. City merchants were trading with Europe. They were backing ventures as far afield as Russia, the Americas, India. Just upriver from here, there's a replica of the Golden Hind, the ship in which Sir Francis Drake sailed round the world. We'd never been more connected. But I'm not talking about cosmopolitan just in the sense of geography. I'm talking about a state of mind. People who are cosmopolitan, they're subtle, they're sophisticated, they're witty, they're urban. They've got minds open to every experience, the high life, the low life, and that's what Shakespeare had. And he took all of this rich experience and he served it up at the Globe, what he called his wooden O. And his audience, who got his wavelength, they lapped it up. And in this flowering of ideas and intellect, we moved as a nation from the old to the new.